the title I wanted was Half Brain Christianity, because we're missing half of our brains. It's like, and we're missing the most important half is the one, those kind of skills, developing that part of our brain is the most important. And that's the one we're leaving out. The publisher thought that was a little too negative, like they wanted something that's positive. And so we went around and around and around.
Welcome to the Exponential Groups podcast. I'm your host, Alan White. This podcast is designed to help you take the guesswork out of groups. In each episode, you will discover effective ways to recruit more leaders, form better groups, and make more disciples. Please subscribe to this monthly podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. Welcome to episode 14. Today's guest is Michel Hendricks. Michel is the co-author with Jim Wilder of The Other Half of Church, Christian Community, Brain Science, and Overcoming Spiritual Stagnation. He is the director of transformational consulting at Life Model Works. He's the former pastor of spiritual formation at Flatirons Community Church in Lafayette, Colorado. He's also served in Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico, Costa Rica, Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda. He and his wife have 3 adult children. For the show notes for this episode, go to alanwhite.org/14, just the number 14. Now, my conversation with Michel Hendricks. Michel, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Alan. It's good to be here.
Hey, boy, this book, The Other Half of Church, it's rocked my world. It's rocked a lot of my friends' world. So I have all kinds of questions for you today. So let's go back to when this kind of rocked your world. So you were serving as a discipleship pastor in a large church. You were experiencing some dissatisfaction with how the church was making disciples. Tell us about that.
Dissatisfaction was in the whole disciple-making process in general. As a pastor of discipleship, I tried a lot of things, including kind of a beginner's book, basic training because we had a lot of really new believers. I did a 5-week training in spiritual disciplines, a Bible reading plan, all this kind of stuff. And the thing I kept bumping into is that those things worked really well for some kinds of problems, and they didn't seem to work at all for others. And some people responded really well. Others didn't respond at all. I kept bumping up against this word sometimes. Like it would work. They seemed to be working sometimes and not others. And so my dissatisfaction was more like it seemed to me that I was missing some big pieces of the puzzle, but I had no idea what those pieces were.
And so from reading the book and knowing the story, about at this point, you were introduced to Jim Wilder, who was called a neurotheologian. So what did you begin to learn from him, and what in the world is a neurotheologian? So from reading the book, at this point, you were introduced to a neurotheologian named Jim Wilder. So what in the world is a neurotheologian, and what did you begin to learn from him?
Yeah, well, in my frustration being a discipleship pastor, I ended up meeting up with a man who had done this kind of thing his whole life and wanted to have lunch with me. And I kind of shared some of my frustrations about the sometimes, where it seems to work so like we're missing big pieces. And he said, well, let's start meeting together and studying discipleship. And I pulled another pastor friend in. And he was the one who the first time, so we're reading books and we're trying to study every angle of discipleship possible. And he's the one that mentioned, he said, we need to make sure we don't also forget the role the brain plays in discipleship. And that was so outside my way of thinking that I kind of didn't even know what he meant to say. And it seemed kind of weird even. And so I kind of ignored the topic and we went on to another topic. But a month later, you were meeting every month. He mentioned it again. And he says, I think we need to take in count the role that neuroscience plays in how God designed the human brain to form our character and to mature us. At that point, the second time I looked at him, his name's Bob. I said, Bob, and Bob kind of smiled and said, well, let me invite my friend, Dr. Jim Wilder, to our meeting next month, our lunch. And I think he can probably answer your question better than I could. And so it was that lunch where we sat down and my friend Bob introduced me. This is Jim Wilder. He's a neurotheologian. He studies the cross section of the Bible and brain science and discipleship and how we learn and grow as Christians. And when he said neurotheologian, I thought, I've never heard that word in my life. I don't know what that means, but I was fascinated. I was interested. I was especially interested because I was right at the point where I was bumping up against the wall. I'm basically hitting my head on the wall over and over again as a discipleship pastor. And all of a sudden, there's someone here that has some new information or some new perspective. I've never heard of it before. And so Jim looked across the table at me and he said, well, Michel, what do you want out of this meeting? And I said, I would love to know a little bit about the role the brain plays in discipleship and how we grow as Christians. And I'd also like to kind of, try some of these new practices out that maybe are practices we don't normally associate with, discipleship, quote unquote. And so Jim had bent over and pulled a plastic brain out of his bag, and he disconnected the two halves of the brain and started showing us how information, how our relational surroundings and the way we perceive it flow through the brain, what he calls the control processor of the brain. And he says we really have two brains. We have a left brain and a right brain. They focus on very different problems. So they're very interconnected too. They play together. They're not separate, but it's almost like they're like two brains because they really do specialize in different tasks. And he said the left brain is what we usually just think of as the brain. It's thinking, problem solving, talking, telling stories, is our willpower, information, all of that kind of stuff is really heavily left brain conscious. But he said the right brain is actually the more powerful brain, but it's pre-conscious. In other words, it doesn't process words, but it's our relational brain. It processes who are we attached to, who are the people who are most meaningful to us. It has to do with how we process emotions and grow emotional resilience. Emotional resilience is not a term I used a lot in discipleship, but Jim says it's one of the keys to be able to stay loving and relational in the midst of intense emotions. It's when we most easily stop acting like Christians. We stop loving people well. And I thought, okay, that's another category I've never thought of before. And he said, right brain is where we build our relational skills, how we interact with people, how we resolve conflict in ways that are humble and kind, interactive versus I power up on you and try to win. It's where we experience God's presence non-verbally, where we can kind of just feel that God is with us. Most of us Christians, if we've been walking with Jesus for a while, there's times when he feels so close. And there's other times where it feels like, I feel kind of like I'm all alone in this right now. And that's very much a right brain skill. And you can build your ability to stay connected and sense his connection. It's something, it's a part of our brain called the cingulate cortex that allows us to feel attuning and to tune with each other. And love, the big thing, the right brain, really the whole brain, but the right brain especially was designed with love as its basic design premise. It's all has to do with love. And, you don't read very much of the Bible or go very far into reading about Jesus' life where Jesus puts love front and center in discipleship. And so once he started explaining these things, I was all in. I was all in. The one thing Jim said that really shook my world, and he'd said over the last 500 years or so, we've largely put our discipleship into our left brain, but the right brain is really where character is formed. So we're actually ignoring, we need a right brain and left full brain discipleship, but we're really ignoring the half of the brain that has the more powerful role. And so he's really about, let's bring our discipleship back into a full brain discipleship where we have good information of willpower and choices and things like we've been doing, but we also learn to love each other. Even in distress, we learn to stay relational and sense God's presence and attune to each other. All those things are very, very important in discipleship, but I never emphasize those things. It was a whole new virgin territory that had never been explored for me.
Yeah. And it seems like the dilemma has been, I talk to a lot of pastors and they say, well, how do we disciple a new believer? And I'm thinking, well, good grief, the church has been at this for 2,000 years and we can't disciple a new believer. What are we doing? But now you told me recently that your book, The Other Half of Church, you had proposed a different name to your publisher. What were you going to call it and why?
Well, from those conversations with Jim Wilder and others, when I had the chance to write the book, and Jim's the one who kind of threw it to me, gave me this opportunity. And the title I wanted was Half Brain Christianity, because we're missing half of our brains. It's like, and we're missing the most important half is the one, those kind of skills, developing that part of our brain is the most important. And that's the one we're leaving out. The publisher thought that was a little too negative, like they wanted something that's positive. And so we went around and around and around on the title. And finally, just one of the people that worked there we didn't even know that well. He just says, well, how about The Other Half of Church? And I said okay, I think I could live with that because it's, it doesn't really explain what it's about, but it makes you curious. I want to know more. What do you mean, what other half? And so that's how we settled on that.
Yeah, well, I actually spent a couple of months going chapter by chapter through the book with a dozen pastors, and we referred to ourselves as the half-brain group. But what we had to say, we were half-brain, not half-wits, because that would be a whole other thing, right? Right. So, looking at, you'd mentioned, how the church has attempted to make disciples in the last 500 years. Obviously, 500 years ago, the invention of the printing press, getting the book back in the hands of the people. But then it almost seems like the Enlightenment just kind of hijacked the whole disciple making process. And, and we've experienced people that are very knowledgeable about scripture. And yet when you look at their attitudes, when you look at their actions, not quite reflecting. And so one of the things you guys were kind of wrestling with in the book was just the idea of accumulating knowledge and making right choices isn't actually the formula for developing Christ-like character. And then you talk about 4 elements that are necessary. So what are these elements? I know we could talk for like 5 hours on this, but what are these elements and how do they help people to grow, to become more like Christ?
Yeah, these elements are very largely love-based. Everything is centered on love. It's very relational. It's very dominantly placed in the right brain, these skills. We're not saying, by the way, that we think the left brain skills, studying the Bible, studying scripture diligently, memorizing scriptures, praying together, although praying is a full-brained activity, listening to sermons, those are all important. What we're saying is that let's bring the other half in and have them both work together.
Right.
And so in the book, we use the analogy of soil, because the church, and specifically thinking of the discipleship process that Jesus told us to go and make disciples, what we're trying to do is grow people. We're trying to grow a people that learn to live in God's kingdom on earth. And the central quality of those people is that they love really well. Okay, so this is all, again, aimed at love. And so we use the analogy of soil because we drew from an experience of mine when I planted tomatoes in our home, and they just went crazy. They almost like took over our house. We had hundreds of tomatoes. By the time the frost was coming, in Colorado, you have to pick all your green tomatoes when the first frost comes because it'll kill everything. And I picked up something like 400 tomatoes. I was like, whoa, this is easy.
Wow.
And the following year, it was pretty good. And I had about half that much. And the next year, less. And pretty soon, it's like I got 20 tomatoes the entire year. And I'm like, what's going on here? And I looked it up online and it said, oh, yeah, tomatoes are tremendous users of all the nutrients of the soil. It'll run your soil dry. It'll kind of run it down. And so if you plant tomatoes, you need to need to constantly rebuild the soil with nutrients and everything that the tomatoes need to grow. And we think that's a good analogy for this, that the soil of the church has really gotten run down to grow people who love like Jesus loves. We really want to grow a people who can love like Jesus loves. And so the 4 elements of that soil or nutrients are joy, hesed, group identity, and healthy correction. And we go into the book, there's a chapter on each one of those. Joy is really fundamental. That's the one thing, Jim said to us when he's explaining the right brain. Our right brain is looping 6 times a second, and it's really looking for one thing before everything else, and it's looking for faces that are happy to be with me. It's nonverbal. It's a twinkle in someone's eye. It's their face lighting up. Words aren't necessary, and you can tell, ooh, I'm special to that person. And he said our brain desires that more than any other thing, and it almost functions like gasoline in a car. A car needs more than just gasoline, but without gasoline, it's useless. It won't go anywhere. And so it's kind of the energy. It's the thing that energizes all the other things we do. And so the things we need to add to the soil of our churches is that they should be high joy environments where our faces light up. I think in number 6, the prayer that God taught Moses, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you, and we read that. There's a song about Jesus in the New Testament where it says, awake sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And it's very much pulling from, that number 6 verse, that feeling Jesus's face shining on us, that he's so happy to be with us. He's glad that we're special to him. And we need to build that joy with God to be able to receive the joy, because a lot of times he's joyful with us, but we just can't receive it. And we need to build that with each other. And that's like the first nutrient you add to the soil. And as you add that very, slowly the soil starts getting better. And then the second nutrient is related, and it's called hesed, which is really the Hebrew word for love, but it's much deeper than just the word love. It functions as an attachment that's like a family level of bonding. Imagine a family level of bonding in our church. When my son graduated from high school and went to college, my wife and I were like in a funk for a month. It's like the house, there was a hole in our house, a void. It's like, oh man, it almost felt like he had died. We were like, wow, we are in mourning right now. Even though we could call him and talk to him and he was doing well and everything, that's the kind of bond. That's, with that bond comes, you expose yourself to more sadness, because like when people leave the church, that should be a very sad event. It should take us a while to get over that, even if they're leaving for good reasons. God's called us to a new job in another area. This is really hard, but it should, hesed love is a love that it's a lifelong concern for each other's well-being. It's a love bond that builds joy, and joy and hesed really have this circle of building each other. When we build joy together, it deepens our hesed, our love for each other. And as our love grows, our joy for each other. So this joy hesed cycle is just, it's like digging a bunch of fertilizer into the soil, right? And if you do that, it'll grow anything, right? Unfortunately, it won't always just grow good things only, just like a garden. If I plowed a bunch of fertilizer into my garden and that's all I did, I would get some lettuce and some tomatoes and some carrots, but I'd also get weeds just going nuts everywhere. And so the second two nutrients of healthy soil, more than we have this good fertilizer with joy and hesed, and then the second two nutrients focus on, are we growing the right thing? The first nutrient that helps with this task is group identity, and it's really our brain as well as looking for constantly asking the question, what do my people do in this situation? What do my people do when someone cuts me off in traffic? What do my people do when I win the lottery? What do my people do when my boss loses his cool with me in front of the whole team? What do my people do when my son does a silly thing and gets kicked out of school? What do my people do when I have some extra money from an inheritance and there's a lot of places to put it? What do my people do when I lost my job and I have no idea what I'm going to do next? When I find myself getting angry at really little things, or I could go on and on and on. And group identity really builds out what the larger 10,000-foot Christian characteristics of loving our neighbors ourselves, being slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen, all those kinds of things. And then we're boiling them down into their everyday life, right? Like, we are a people who are slow to speak and quick to listen because that keeps us from blowing up and being impatient with people, right?
I like that. And there's actually a word in the Greek for disciple that the literal meaning is the idea of to rub off on.
Yep.
I should have the word memorized so I sound more intelligent, but anyway. But the idea of rubbing off on each other, of this is the kind of attitude, this is the way we think about it. And I remember even my oldest son had bought an Apple Watch. I've been telling him for years, things don't make us happy, because if things made us happy, we would be happy. Yeah. And so he gets this new Apple Watch and he says, wow, I really thought I would be happier, with this watch than I am. And I said, well, why do you think that? He said, because things don't make us happy. And I was like, oh, it sunk in. He heard it. He heard it. Now, one of the things, as I was reading the chapter about group identity, and I like the idea of we're people who do this, we're people who don't do that. However, the do's and don'ts kind of went back to some legalism that I grew up with. So how do you keep this idea of group identity from becoming legalistic?
That's a great question. First of all, group identity is not so much talking about what we don't do. That will get into the fourth soil. It's always about what it looks like to live in God's kingdom on earth. And it has to do, again, it's all tied back to loving well. So let's go back to the one I mentioned. We are people who are slow to speak and quick to listen. Well, I would say a majority of our relational problems we have this element in it, where I just something came out of me really fast at you. And then later I thought, oh man, I wish I would have never said that to Alan. Why did I say that? Sometimes I need to go back and clean up the mess. Like, hey, Alan, this was reminding me of another issue I had and I kind of blew up on you and stuff, right? Well, how do we change our spontaneous action to be patience and being slow to speak? That's through group identity. Group identity works in the faster track of our brain that's preconscious. It's preconscious means it's faster than our ability to realize what's going on. Group identity, if we start building it and talking and sharing stories about being slow to speak and quick to listen, and we can also even share stories of when I didn't do that and say, what it really looks like for me to act like in that situation, I really would have acted this way. So we don't even need to be perfect. We can share our failures and still build group identity of when I was quick to speak and blew something up.
So this really goes to kind of the idea of the half brain thing, that if I went and read a book about it, then I might catch a little bit of that. But there's something stronger with being with a group of people who are actually practicing.
Right. The left brain knowledge and information help us go clean up the mess as well. When I'm quick to speak and I say something to you that I then wish, that I really think, God, Jesus, I never saw Jesus doing things like that. And then the left brain activity would be, I go to you and apologize and show you where I was wrong, and we get good together and stuff. It cleans up messes. But how do I change my spontaneous reaction to what happened in that meeting when I kind of blew up at you. That's faster than my willpower. That's one of the left brain things is willpower. And we'd say, well, next target, here's some truth. You'll show me that James verse that says, be slow to speak, and then I'll try as hard as I can. The problem is that doesn't work because this is much faster. My reaction's always already out by the time I realize, oh, that's not the way we act. Thinking is too slow. But if I was around some people like you and others that are modeling it, we're speaking it to each other, we're sharing our failures and then saying what this would have looked like had it been slow to speak is this way. And this is the way we act. This is who we are as people. My brain actually absorbs that in the faster process. I'll start seeing spontaneous incidents where I'll be slow to speak in a situation where a year ago, I would have words would have come out really fast that then later I'd have to clean up. Almost seems kind of magic. Like when Jim was telling me this, I'm thought, does this really work? But I thought, I am desperate enough. I'll try it. It doesn't hurt, right? I'll try this. And I would start to see some spontaneous changes in situations, intense relational situations that I'd come away from and think, wow, a couple of years ago, that would have ended very differently. And that's fun. It's fun to see that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, for a pastor that's listening to us, this is a new concept. It's not something they necessarily practice in their church. How do you get this started?
It's really good to do it in the lead team of a church. There's a lot of churches out there that are they're reading through and going through the exercises of the other habit church as a lead team or as an elder team or as kind of the staff or whatever. And then so they understand the concepts all because you want to do this. Pastors can't do this alone in his office. This is very much a community needed effort. And so get people through this and then get them together and say, let's start building a group identity for our people here in this church. You can start with some basic ones that are true of all times. And then different societies, different communities across our land and across the world have different strengths and weaknesses. And so even in different churches do, and there's you'll start to see some character weaknesses in our church and then start building specifically that area of the soil up, right? Like rich churches versus poor churches are going to have different kinds of, an immigrant church that's bilingual is going to have certain problems and certain benefits. The education level will change things, the culture, what part of the country and what part of the world you're living in. But they're all aiming it at love, helping us. So, there's also a 12-week exercises we can take you through at Life Model Works called the Pandora Problem exercises, which takes you through group identity 12 weeks in a row. And really, really good. And use your imagination. We're the experts in the theory, but we want to spread this to as many pastors and lead teams and staffs as possible of Christian churches and organizations. Go try stuff we've never mentioned. And especially when you find things that are working, get back to me and let me know. Because I think we're really going to make this change as a community, learning community together, where a couple pastors in Kansas find something out, they call me, and then I start spreading it to all the pastors I know. Mm-hmm. There's no experts in this. There's no heroes in this new other half of church. It's going to be very much a community effort where we're all trying stuff and sharing what's working and sharing what's not working, and we're learning together.
That's good, because that's one of the dilemmas we had with the book group that we were reading the book with. Was we're trying to educate ourselves on how the right half of the brain works, but we're reading a book. So it's the left half of the brain processing what should be going on in the right half of the brain. But we were having a discussion as a community. So that helped us out a little bit. But, the main thing was these concepts were so new to us. Yep. So we have joy, and we have hesed, and we have group identity, and then we have loving correction.
Healthy correction.
There we go. I knew there was something, some adjective beforehand. So what does healthy correction look like? Hey,
so group identity. Yeah, exactly. Group identity tells us who we are, what it looks like to be our people, to act like our people, like the people of God. Healthy correction shows us what to do when we stop acting like ourselves, which all of us do at times. We call it healthy correction because most of us kind of flinch at the word correction because most of us have been corrected in the unhealthy way. Unhealthy correction is basically, I just tell you what you did wrong and then I leave. It's some form of the message that you are bad. You screwed up, don't do that again. It's a threat. And I leave you there. And so part of the exercises, and you said, a book is mainly a left brain thing, but the exercises at the end of each chapter will then bring you into your right brains. Every one of those exercises is pretty right brain dominant. Even one of the exercises is rejecting unhealthy correction. We need to practice rejecting the wrong kind of correction that doesn't invite us into a community, but leaves us there as you are bad. But a healthy correction, the kind of form is, Alan, back there, I think you forgot who we are. Let me remind you, when you did, let's say you got mad at me instead of mad at you in a meeting or something, you blew your stack. And I say, I really love working with you in our church. And I love how God has made you. And you are a kind and patient person. And it seemed like back there, you kind of forgot who you are. So are you open for me kind of reminding us who we are? We are people who are very slow to speak, but we're very fast to listen. And it seemed you were pretty fast to speak there. And when Susan brought up that one comment that you didn't care for, it seemed like you stopped listening. And that's not like you. And I wanted to remind you who you are because I like you so much. And I'm so glad we get to work together. So that's an example of healthy correction, which I'm inviting you into the relationship. I'm making it very relational. I'm showing where you forgot who you were. And I'm saying, come back to us and let me remind you who we really are in this kind of a situation, like in this meeting.
On the way that you approached that, it felt affirming just hearing you say that to me. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't even, a real issue in this instance. I will give you an example. Years ago, when I was on staff at a church in California, I had fallen into the habit of using a word that wasn't very polite, and I won't tell you what it was. Yeah. But my senior pastor pulled me into his office in a very caring, very loving way, said, when you use this word, it takes away from who you are. Mm. And I stopped using the word. It wasn't a matter of, well, you're a pastor, you're a man of God, you should know better, you should stop talking. It wasn't a scolding way. It was a very gentle, loving way. This takes away from who you are. And because of that, I was very open and accepting. It worked. I dropped that term from my vocabulary, and I'm sure everybody was relieved.
Kind of the formula is we affirm our attachment, our hesed. Mm-hmm. And then I tell you how I think I perceive that you stopped acting like yourself. And then I remind you what it looks like. How do our people act in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of I'm not going to throw you away. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to leave you behind. I'm not going to look down on you. We're family. We're growing together. Yep. None of us are perfect, but we're also not going to give up on you.
Right.
And that, that in itself was very affirming. So we have the 4 soils, and I know there's so much there, but you also talk about in the book that if those 4 soils, the joy, hesed, group identity, and healthy correction, I got it right that time. If those things are not present, then it allows for narcissism. So what is narcissism, and how do these soils or these elements, how do they curtail that?
So narcissism is the weed that grows in depleted soil, the depleted relational soil. A narcissist is a person who's unable to receive correction. The technical definition that Jim Wilder told us is a narcissist, the person who's unable to metabolize the emotion of shame. Metabolize means you stay relational. You can stay relational when someone is, shame is really the opposite of joy. I'm not happy to be with you right now, right? So if I was quick to speak when Susan said something I didn't like, and I kind of lambasted her, you saw that in the meeting, you come to me, but your face, in that moment, you weren't that happy to be with me because you're seeing me not act like myself. So if we can stay, and then when you come to my office, I can tell from your face that there's something wrong. There's something between us right now, right? I'm reading that. My brain is reading that non-verbally before a word comes out of your mouth. Can I stay relational in that moment, or do all of a sudden? And that's that feeling of shame where, okay, Alan's not pleased with me, and then if I can metabolize and stay relational in shame, I'm like, okay, speak to me. Maybe you're right, Alan. If I cannot metabolize shame, if I can't receive correction, I'm thinking the 4 or 5 points that I need to tell Alan to show him that I'm right and he's wrong. I'm using self-justifying in order to keep your correction away from my character. Because we have a broken picture of leadership in our country that's very heavily tainted by narcissism. We actually see a narcissistic leader and often think, wow, what a strong leader, what a bold person. But if we, take that leader on one hand and take a good hard look at Jesus, we don't see that in Jesus at all.
No, we don't. And then we usually wonder, wow, they were such a powerful leader. They were such a great speaker. They grew such a great church. Why did that happen to them?
Yep.
And we're kind of championing the wrong things. My encounters with narcissism have been people that, because they can't metabolize shame. I like how you put that. Then they blame other people for what they did. They try to justify themselves. I've even been in situations where, People were paying for a service, and then the narcissist blamed the customer for not accomplishing what they had paid for. And I'm just like, how in the world is that the customer's fault?
Yeah.
Now, having had some of those experiences in my own life where I was ready for you to go in the book and you guys let me down. But where I wanted you to go was to say, get your torches, get your pitchforks, drive the narcissists out of the church. And then you turned around and said, these healthy communities with these elements, we need to love our narcissist. And I just sat there and said, no.
Yeah. Relationally speaking, a narcissist is like a person with a broken leg. It's a deep brokenness. Can we get through their self-justifications and their need to win all arguments and inability to receive any kind of corrections and see them from Jesus's eyes, which is like, oh, this person is broken and needs help. Don't abandon them. Don't leave this man or this woman behind. Now, a lot of us think, even most psychologists believe narcissism is incurable, and Jim Wilder's really an expert in that, and he would say, narcissism is incurable in a one-on-one situation, like with a counselor. A one-on-one confrontation is never going to work. You need to bring into the group identity area of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex on the right side. You need to have lots of well-built, strong attachments to him, well-built group identity that he agrees with. And if you can start appealing very gently, we're gentle confronters, right? We're not harsh confronters, but we're not gentle enablers. We're gentle confronters when we see someone not acting like who we are as the people of God. And we gently confront and say, hey, I really appreciate that you're leading this meeting. I appreciate the effort. And it was a really good meeting too. I think we got a lot done, but the way you handled with Susan there, it seemed to me like you were really, really quick to speak and to let her know that you were right and she was wrong. And if you remember from our group identity that we've been practicing, we're not a people, we are a people that are slow to speak and very, very, very fast to listen. And it seemed you were the opposite. If you've been preparing the soil of that church, this is hard to do because sometimes narcissists won't let you do that. Right. So we're speaking about the ideal model. We're also speaking about every church should be doing this, even if you don't have a narcissistic pastor, because who knows, the next staff member or pastor that comes along. If you're building up your soil right now and they get there, the narcissism in them will not be able to thrive. And so they will either change or they will jump ship. But what they won't do is what happens too often is go like a weed and just start growing everywhere and covering all the plants up and squeezing all the fruit out of that church.
That's good. It's difficult, but it's good. So these concepts, obviously, from things that we've learned in seminary, things that we've learned in ministry, speaking of pastors in general, are different. We didn't have classes on this in school. Mm-hmm. And I find obviously, a lot of times the dilemma of making disciples is that the disciple maker wasn't ever properly discipled themselves.
Right.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if a pastor or a church is interested in this, clearly they can go and get a copy of the other half of church. But how do you help pastors implement this in their ministries, in their own lives, in their churches?
Yeah, those you just kind of got on the first one I would recommend is to, go through, read the other half of church together with your team, with your group, whatever that is for your ministry or church. There's a church here in Boulder that the entire 20-person staff read through it, but not just read through it, do the exercises together. As a matter of fact, the reading you can do on your own and maybe discuss some, but make sure you do the exercises at the end of the chapter together and let that right brain start to develop. That's a good, easy first step to do that. And also prepares you for the second thing is that we are open and are actually developing consulting to ministries and churches where we can meet with you in a consistency or frequency that works for you, both in person, if you're in our area, or online. We can do some travel for one-time events, but a lot of what we do is just start to regularly meet with a team of people in a church, and it's much more training than content it's new practices, and we just do those practices, but we do them together. Again, that's the key. Get your kind of key, your people. Usually it's like a team of, 5 to 12 to 20, somewhere around there. And we just do these practices together. Maybe we'll do it once a month. Maybe we'll do it twice a month. And then you'll be able to practice things in between the meetings and over again, and then come back and we unpack those practices. And that's one of the most important things to do, because some people will love it and other people will go, that didn't seem to work for me at all. And handling that the right way and unpacking both of those well is it's the best learning experience you can have. And so we would love to work with you if you have, and we're very flexible in how we offer it, for different schedules for different kinds of ministries and churches, but we would love to help you get the other half of church into your community.
In the book, you talk a lot about the group that met down in your basement.
Yep.
And I think the longing from everybody in this book group that we had was they really wanted to see a recording of what was going on in that basement and what you guys were doing. So so very practically, how are you integrating these practices in your life right now as a believer? What does that look like?
Well, one of the joy practices I do, I'm going to teach you several. If we work together, I'll teach you several ways that things we do to build joy. One of them is good gratitude practices. And there's even a nonverbal gratitude practice where you go back, you start making a list of gratitude memories where, it's something you're really grateful for. You feel like you can kind of feel God involved in it. You can feel his pleasure or his smile or him saying something or communicating something to you. And you can go back and relive it and kind of feel it in your body again. And that's kind of like a gratitude memory practice that you're sitting in gratitude in a memory. It's not verbal, you're kind of reliving it. And that's really, really healthy for your brain. And it also builds hesed with God, because you're going back into some kind thing God did for you, and you're marinating in it. And you're just it's building joy with God, which builds our hesed with God, and our attachment to him. That's one of the things I do every day. Another one is quieting, learning how to quiet two things: quiet big emotions and learning how to quiet the hamster wheel of thoughts. And then to sit, we find this all over scripture. It's not so much a Buddhist meditation where they kind of sit into a nothingness. Rather, our meditation is, I don't even call it meditation. I call it quieting, because that's what David says. I've still calmed and quieted my soul. We read in the Psalms, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Be still and know I'm God. We're quieting the thoughts, and we're just sitting in God's presence and just enjoying his presence with no thoughts and no words. And so instead of a nothingness, it's very much a fullness. I actually start feeling God's presence more strongly when I can stop the hamster wheel and when I can calm the big emotions, and then I just sit in his presence. I do that 3 minutes every day. And sometimes it's so good, I'll just keep going on and it'll be a half hour. So there's a couple right brain practices that will build your joy and your hesed in your community and in your own life. And it's kind of a foundational skill as well for other things we'll build on top of.
That's great. That's great. And I practiced silence for a number of years. And it's a difficult thing to do. And some people have, thought, well, wait a minute, isn't this, like transcendental meditation or something? I'm like, no, it's not. I like the idea, the notion of quieting yourself. But the thought to me was, God doesn't need me to figure out anything right now. God doesn't need me to troubleshoot anything or plan anything. That he's in control of all that. And I'm just with my Heavenly Father right now. And I can just be quiet and enjoy his presence and just calm all of that down. And it does so many things as far as, stress. I do that, set it on my calendar a couple times a day. And it changes my whole outlook. And even being in some situations that were kind of rocky, I found that I could be a little more steady through those. Yep. Just by quieting myself. Well, Michael, this is so great. I could just talk to you forever, and maybe I'll have you back at some point. But thank you for the book, and thank you for getting the word out there, for joining us. And so, for those who want more information about the books or about the consulting that Michael does, you can find that in the show notes. But thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan, so much. I really enjoyed this, and thank you everyone who's listening. And I love that you're going on this journey with us.
Now, at this point, you may be asking, hey, where's the Ask Alan segment with the funny prize wheel? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Ask Alan segment has actually become its own weekly podcast called the Healthy Groups Podcast. For more information, go to alanwhite.org/podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode with Michel Hendricks, please share it with a friend. And to help others find us, please rate and review this podcast on your preferred podcast platform. Say that 3 times fast. All right. Thank you for listening.